Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Antelope Hill Book Club. Today we're discussing Paleface by Wyndham Lewis, and we have with us Borzoi, a.k.a. John Chapman, who wrote a wonderful foreword to the book. But before we get started, as always, I'm your host, Taylor Young.
And I'm Sean Bell.
And we'll hand it over to Borzoi now to give us an introduction to the book.
So I wasn't really sure if I wanted to start with reminding people kind of Wyndham Lewis's background. I did a pretty good, I think, exploration of that in the Hitler foreword that I did. But what I will just say briefly on Wyndham Lewis for people who don't know who he was a very important early 20th century British writer who was associated with all the modernist writers. He was friends with Ezra Pound. He knew a lot of the people that were in and out of those circles. He really came into, he was also a painter. He had started his own artistic movement, kind of riffing off of Cubism called Vorticism. But he really came to prominence when he wrote his novel Tar, which had the kind of experimental language and literary techniques that people tend to associate with the modernist literary movements. And he was one of the first ones to really publish a novel like that, but his star really fell as in the subsequent years, like many of the modernist writers, he dove into radical politics, but unlike a lot of his contemporaries, he really dove deeper into it than they did, and he got more into very explosive and either outright right-wing or quasi-right-wing movements. And then towards later in his life, he became a bit more reactionary in his perspectives, largely because of the kind of ostracism and problems that his more explosive politics and his desire to forge a new path had caused for him. But really it was, I think people know at this point as well, what really caused his reputation a lot of damage, which he's never fully recovered from, despite his best efforts to do so, was his book Hitler that he wrote in 1930, it being known as kind of the only book in the English language was about Hitler before Hitler became chancellor. So he was ahead of the curve on that. It was right when the National Socialists were starting to rise. But that's not what we're talking about. We are talking about a book he wrote a couple of years before Hitler called Paleface. And this book is kind of in the chronology of books that Wyndham Lewis wrote that attempted to really ask and really criticize some very essential things that were going on in societies and artistic movements, and especially this interwar period was a time of massive change. And race was starting to come quite to the forefront, both on social issues and in literary issues. And so Wyndham Lewis wrote this book, which is kind of fascinating because it's largely actually a piece of literary criticism where he's critiquing contemporary authors like D.H. Lawrence and Sherwood Anderson specifically. There's a little bit of Ernest Hemingway in there too, but his two specific targets are D.H. Lawrence and Sherwood Anderson. But the book is also a polemical of his various views on the state of Europe and the white man and the issue of race, talking about it frankly in a way that a lot of writers at that time period were very afraid to touch, or it was assumed there was no reason to touch it because white supremacy, and I'm using that term in its clinical definition, just the supremacy of white nations, the supremacy of white people, especially in their own societies and in their colonies, was just such an assumed position that it was impossible to think that there would be any other type of society or any kind of revolutionary change that would happen to fundamentally end that. And that's kind of what makes Paleface a very fascinating book. I guess that would be a pretty good introduction right there. I don't know if you guys have any questions about kind of like that introduction, if you just want to get into it from there.
Oh, well, I wanted to ask you, I feel like I know a decent amount of literature, right? Like a reasonably well-read person, and yet Wyndham Lewis is an obscure figure to me. So I was just wondering about your personal journey to him and how you became interested. Was it through the fiction, through books like Tar?
It was through Antelope Hill, because I never read. The funny thing is, I've always been interested in a lot of different authors, but I never was interested in Wyndham Lewis. Well, the main reason is I'm just not into British authors for the most part. The biggest change that happened with that was getting into D.H. Lawrence a few years ago, and that was really what got me more interested in British literature. But I knew people who were big Wyndham Lewis fans on Twitter. One of them, who was a very fantastic account, I don't think he's around anymore. I don't think he respawned on another account, but Snooty Baronet, which he took the name from Wyndham Lewis's probably most famous novel, which was a satire of aristocratic British society. He and a few other Twitter users were really into Wyndham Lewis. It was not something I was interested in, though, but when Antelope Hill asked me to a forward on Hitler, that was really what started me on Wyndham Lewis. And much like I started reading D.H. Lawrence, I became very fascinated by this figure. And it's obvious that the reason for his relative obscurity now is because of those books that he wrote, the problematic books, as it were. In fact, most people who analyze it now are either these very obscure Twitter users, or it's people who do very academic papers and criticism of the connection between fascism and the modernist movements. In fact, when I did the foreword for Paleface, I drew a lot from their criticism because they wrote interesting things about it, and they wrote very enlightening things about it that were very relevant to this. But Wyndham Lewis became a very fascinating figure to me because of these contradictions. Jonathan Bowden had a really good lecture that he did about Wyndham Lewis because, unsurprisingly, if you're familiar with Jonathan Bowden's work and the kind of art he was interested in, he comes directly from that Wyndham Lewis tradition. If you love Jonathan Bowden, then you will love Wyndham Lewis, because I don't think there would be a Jonathan Bowden as he was without Wyndham Lewis. Once you read more of Wyndham Lewis, and you will see the things that Jonathan Bowden was drawing, things that he explicitly cited, but in a lot of his mannerisms, the way he talked about art, knowledge of art, the way he viewed what the purpose of art was, the way that he had an open mind towards very experimental art, all of that comes from Wyndham Lewis, in my opinion. It was a great day. Go ahead.
At some point, if you could get around to talking about how this book specifically and your interest in Wyndham Lewis generally has maybe changed your relationship to D.H. Lawrence, that might be interesting.
And that's very relevant to Paleface, because this was an interesting book for me to read, because Wyndham Lewis had an issue with D.H. Lawrence, and he outright criticizes him in this. Now, I think I said in the foreword that there's some nuance to this, because he was responding to a very specific book that Lawrence wrote called Mornings in Mexico. But Lawrence had a much more expansive view on race. But where Wyndham Lewis is coming from on this is that he thinks that D.H. Lawrence gives too much credence to the primitive races and engages in too much of kind of a romanticization of it. And so this was very challenging to me, and this was very fascinating to me, because Wyndham Lewis can be a contradictory figure at times, and he's a very challenging figure. There's stuff I don't agree with on Wyndham Lewis, and this is why I ended up really liking a lot of his stuff, because whether or not you agree with Wyndham Lewis, he asks very probing and important questions, and he causes you to think about your own preconceived notions on things, or your own developed notions on things. He will force you to kind of think in a more lateral way, even if you end up still disagreeing with him, because he asks very important questions. He does not like things to just be assumed. He's the type of writer where he believes that if you want to actually forge a new way, it might entail having to completely build from square one, not going back to square one, but building a brand new square one and starting from there. Because, you can look at the perspective of, you can't go back, because of what you go back to is just led you to here. And then what's the point of going back? It's the same, presumably going to take you back to the same place, which was some of the stuff that was kind of coming up in D.H. Lawrence's writings, because Bowden himself notes this contradiction between D.H. Lawrence and Wyndham Lewis. In his lecture on Wyndham Lewis, he talks about the two of them were often at odds with each other on a very important philosophical and artistic level. He calls Lawrence the traditionalist, in the sense that Lawrence had kind of a primitive pagan. He wanted like a primitive pagan vitalism to be returned to European man, whereas for Lewis, he's a little bit more of the Nietzschean, of there needs to be an overcoming of these things from the past in order to build something new and something more that will bring us into our own being, into what we. I guess the way I put it was, for Lawrence, it was to become who you are. For Lewis, it's to build what you must become.
If you could talk a little bit about, or maybe try and boil down for me the essence of the argument that Wyndham Lewis is making in this book about, like, the causes of this trend to romanticize the noble savage. He There are a couple of things that like rhyme with each other in what he says. For instance, the way that he argues that nationalism, which purports to protect the uniqueness of the nations, ultimately leads to their homogenization, right? And the way that science and technology crowd out the realm of the political, and it leads people into this subjective space. But the thing that was so hard for me is that, like you said, it's a very polemical work. So in order to really engage with it, you have to have like a pretty deep understanding of the various lineages of like that lead to modern literature, right? You have to understand how all these various figures related to each other and all related to Walt Whitman, and how, you know, the romantic movement came to be as a historical phenomenon. So if you could help me with that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, this is the most challenging aspect of Paleface for people is going to be, if you haven't read Sherwood Anderson, if you haven't read D.H. Lawrence, and you haven't read some of the, he talks about Spengler in the book, he talks about Bergson, and if you haven't read or aren't familiar with the works of these people, you might end up being lost. He does an okay job of kind of giving you the gist of what his problem is or what he's responding to in the stuff, but it's very easy to get lost in the weeds on the stuff because the point of reference is hard to be familiar with in this day and age if you weren't basically a literary major that specialized in modernist literature or something similar to that. But for Lewis, what he's trying to get across is, so he's reading all of these new works that are coming out, and he's reading these new philosophies that are coming out. Like, you know, Spengler it's been about 10, maybe even less than 10 years since the publication of Decline of the West. And so Spengler's kind of very in vogue at this point. D.H. Lawrence is kind of around his high point right here in his literary career, although he would have also was going to pass in a couple of years anyways. His literary career was kind of cut short. Sherwood Anderson's Dark Laughter was his most popular novel during his lifetime. So he's responding to these high points, and he's starting to read these letters. And he mentioned Dubois. You talked about Dubois as well. He's reading the stuff that a lot of people, even though they're very popular works amongst the literati, these aren't works that are being read by most people. And so what he's seeing is these are what the tastemakers are putting the direction in. In a way, he's kind of doing sounding a warning bell to people, where he's seeing this fetishization of the dark races and this demonization of the pale faces. He kind of says this outright in the early part of the book, that he views it as there's nobody to speak for the true pale faces of the world. And so the people who have kind of a feeling of race but don't have the power, like he had already identified at this point that cosmopolitan peoples had kind of lost that feeling of race, that sense of race, but like the regular people, working people, just average people still had that feeling of race, the esprit de peau, as he calls it in the book. And there's no one to speak for them on this aspect. And a lot of them aren't reading these books that he's responding to. He even calls out multiple times he calls basically the Borzoi people is what he calls them. The reference to that, people send this to me all the time. They think it's hilarious. I've seen it multiple times. Like, they'll get a book and they open it up. It's like, this is a Borzoi book. I didn't pick that moniker from this. That was just a coincidence. Alfred Knopf founded Knopf Books, and he and his wife Blanche owned Borzoi dogs. That's why the Knopf logo, if you look at it, is a Borzoi that's running. And part of their run, they have their own, what they call it in publishing world. You know, you have your company, but then like you have your, kind of like with Antelope Hill, they have their like an imprint. The imprint. It's called? Yes, an imprint. So one of their imprints was called Borzoi Books. And that was where they published a lot of the books that were going to be taste-making novels. These were considered to be the future high point of literature. These were literary books. And Lewis rails against them constantly throughout this book. He doesn't now the Knopfs were Jewish, and I don't recall if he actually calls them out for being Jewish. Lewis had a very complicated relationship with the Jews, which is unsurprising for an Anglo of his character, where it's always been kind of, they'll do this ribbing and they'll make these very critical comments, but they don't go all the way in terms of their anti-Semitic feeling. It's kind of
he also doesn't go all the way with his pro-white inklings either, I must say.
True.
Like, as a spokesman, he is a very reluctant spokesman who, at multiple points in the book, speaks about the relative cultural poverty of the Anglos in particular, but of white people generally in comparison with the supposedly civilized peoples that they conquered, which it was interesting to me, specifically in reference to the Aztecs and the Hindus and the Chinese. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
That goes in hand with the perspective that Lewis has, like, to build what you must become. He's being somewhat overly critical on purpose, because for Lewis, the way he viewed literature, the purpose of literature was to attack. Basically, he's trying to bully white people into becoming even better. That's essentially what he's not. It comes off as shaming because we're not used to the style of literary attack, but I mean, he called his own literary magazine Blast Magazine. Like, it comes across in all of his writings and art that the way he sees to cause a change is you attack, and you stay constantly on the attack in order to get people to respond to that. He's trying to force a reaction. And so by not being like simply a forceful advocate, like he's going to be like the defender of the Palefaces, it's like, no, they may not have a spokesperson, so I will, speak in their favor, but I'm also going to attack them because the fact that they're being subjected to the attack means that they need to toughen up and become an even higher civilization in order to face this coming crisis, this coming race crisis that he sees. I mean, he states this in the introduction that he views the isolation of Europe as extremely artificial and has no reason for being that way. And he's correct on that aspect, that basically Europe had gotten somewhat complacent because of the technological superiority that they had achieved, and that it was harder for great movements of peoples to occur in those time periods over long distances. But because he was deeply interested in technology, he knew that it was not going to be forever the case. It would be very easy for all these people to eventually come to Europe. And well, he was right on this aspect. I mean, it's obviously so and especially with and things aren't going to go back to any type of way that they once were. So the important thing is to kind of be on top of this. It's, Spengler said more or less the same thing in Man and Technics, that once the colored world got its hands on European technics, that these differences that allowed Europe to just kind of assume its position as the rightful, in a rightful superior position was going to be gone. And so these are, Lewis is basically trying to get people to become aware of this so they are ready to fight back and retake that top position. So back to the Borzoi books, he sees basically this, to borrow a term from Bowden, he sees what the role that these Borzoi books are playing is a kind of cultural syphilis that is causing a lot of problems. It's very insidious, it's very nefarious, and which is why he constantly castigates the type of people who read these books and internalize these ideas. It's making the already nebulous situation, the already tenuous situation, even worse, and sapping the Palefaces of their ability to basically really become, come into their own, to, pursue their destiny on this. And you can almost get kind of like a Faustian type argument from Lewis in the things that he's saying in here.
So the Knopf family is one thing. It's not hard to understand why that sort of person would be putting out that sort of material, right? But I guess what I'm trying to get a better handle on is why he thinks that, right? Because he doesn't, as far as I can tell, he doesn't consider this to be some like exogenous thing that is being somehow foisted upon the intelligentsia by like clever Jewish propagandists or something.
Yeah,
it's something within the culture.
He doesn't go really far in that. A lot of his attacks on Knopf, and the book readers that are just more personal attacks. He doesn't really. That's one criticism I kind of have of Lewis, is that he tends to pull his punches in terms of the kind of cultural power that having a stranglehold on literature can actually have.
So, like, Lewis aside, do you have any thoughts on where Romanticism comes from? Right, like, as I read this book, the more I realized that there's a real like lack of depth to my understanding of literary history, right? And leading into the moderns, there's this Romantic period, which is clearly a response to the Enlightenment and to the Industrial Revolution and things like that. And why I bring this up is because Lewis explains the rise of subjectivity in this period as being a result of what we might call the science, capital T, capital S, crowding out any room for discussion. Is that sort of like the kernel of where this comes from in terms of like within the white race, within white people and our culture, Jews aside? There's also a Protestant angle. We couldn't talk about
I have
the
a specific
Puritans.
answer to that, but I want to pull up a quote that'll help answer where I believe Romanticism comes from. Well, so on the origin of Romanticism, I mean, it's deeply connected with the birth of nationalism and being able to examine oneself. Romanticism is almost a type of invented nostalgia because, honestly, it's the result of the French. That's really, really where it kind of comes from. There's a quote from Thomas Madden in his book Istanbul that kind of explains why you had this explosion of nationalism in the 19th century. The West had much to offer the city of Constantinople, but also much to threaten its empire. In Europe, the days of multi-ethnic empires were passing away. Born of the French Revolution and fueled by new technologies such as the railroad and the telegraph, the ideology of nationalism had set fire to the West. It was all the more potent because it was not an invented philosophy, but had grown organically from the new circumstances of the modern world. In pre-modern societies, the average person would live his entire life without leaving the locality of his birth. Thus, he identified with his local clans, associations, and cults. The only thing binding him to the wider world was his religion, and even that was practiced locally. The development of railroads and other means of instant communication changed that. As common people began to travel or spoke to those who had, they discovered that there were people in the world who were not like them, people with very different customs and languages, and some of those people were their rulers. The French, bound together in their great national experiment after 1789, were the first to burn with the zeal of nationalism. They unwittingly brought those flames to other national groups along with their conquering armies. There was, as it happened, no better way to teach Italians about what they had in common than to garrison their cities with French troops. Nationalism became the most powerful dynamic in the course of modern Western history, and remains so today. It is, however, toxic to old-style multi-ethnic empires. Habsburg Austria, the medieval Holy Roman Empire, would be shattered by it. Vienna, though, had a strong economy and modern armies with which to fight back. Constantinople did not. For the Ottoman Empire, nationalism first took root in the Western Balkans, where French soldiers had come after their extermination of the Republic of Venice. The Serbs were the first to band together in a determined effort to win independence from their Turkish overlords. Between 1804 and 1815, Serbian fighters with Russian support managed to neutralize the Ottoman provincial government and form their autonomous principality based in Belgrade. And so this discovery of the outside world in a certain sense, it's one thing in the abstract to know that there is an outside world, but it has no impact on who you are, and it might not impact your day-to-day experience. But as technology pulls us together, as you have more experience being exposed to these outsider elements, it's going to cause a sharpening internally of having a better understanding of who you are. And so Romanticism, after this burst of nationalism, you have to be able to codify this in a way that makes sense and it allows you to deep kind of into that collective unconscious. This is D.H. Lawrence, which is why I always find it funny that Lewis had such a problem with Lawrence on some things. He coined this term called blood consciousness, that even with that when you encounter foreign peoples, that there is something very primitive in how we are deep down beneath all that civilization. You have to have a kind of this knowingness about your own blood, this kind of knowingness about these primal forces that make us human, and then the way that we express that in our shared cultural way. We need to understand that and express that in some way, and that's, in my opinion, where Romanticism comes from, because it develops out of this national consciousness that was forced to form because of this realization of how different other peoples were. And this extends into Paleface, because this is kind of partially what Lewis is talking about in this book, and why he was talking about the artificiality of Europe, is that we were going to have to have a racial reckoning with the non-Paleface world. And it should cause us to have an examination of what it means to be paleface, to be white. And he didn't want these things to be dictated by people who, well, have a fetishization of dark races, because that was only going to make white races sicker by exposure to that.
And just for the benefit of the audience, to be clear, his solution as to how the white race ought to meet up with that reckoning is basically through the Americanization of Europe and the blending of nations, which is, it's certainly a conversation starter. Golly,
this is a book that's going to piss off people who, it's a technically correct term, but I know why people hate it, petty nationalism. For people who basically want to have like a stronghold on that, every European nation be able to be its own independent thing, the Confederacy of Nationalists, this is going to piss people off who have that perspective, because Lewis completely rejects it.
I also was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about, because I totally understand your narrative of where Romanticism comes from and what that has to do with nationalism, and that just makes it all the more interesting that this romantic impulse, given what would that have been, given a century to sort of mutate and maybe go a little rotten, ends up being directed towards the other. How did that happen?
Well, there's only so much you can do with your own romanticism, because eventually you're just going to be saying the same things over and over again, and it might even degrade as your civilization or your culture degrades. Because when romanticism it's something for a new nation, because it's basically the type of myth-making and myth codification and myth reification that a young nation needs in order to establish itself and assert itself. But you can't do that persistently. There's cycles to how culture goes. There's a cycle to how civilizations tend to go. Not necessarily like the whole, hard men create, good times. And not necessarily that cycle, but things in culture cycle in and out. And especially after a culture kind of reaches its zenith, there does tend to be a cultural decline. But that can be reversed if there's something that injects new life into it. You just can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. Because when you already did the best thing in Romanticism, you can't, all you're going to be doing is just repeating the same stuff over and over again. And that's going to lead to a kind of stagnation. So that's how Lewis perceives this. Romanticism had its important time period. It had its necessity in allowing this new consciousness to emerge. But now that technology is drawing the world together even tighter, it's not going to be enough, especially if it's an individualist or individual nation nationalism. It's not going to have the kind of oomph that's going to it's the whole idea of you can be out of touch with your traditions, because traditions are good to have, but there's only so far you can take certain traditions. And as peoples, as civilizations, we tend to adapt traditions as circumstances change. And to Lewis's mind, the circumstances have changed, which is why he wants the Europeans to mix. And then a new Romanticism, a new mythology will emerge from that has to be built. I think for people who struggle with reading Lewis, if you understand it that way, you'll start to – I don't fully agree with Lewis personally, but that's essentially how he views this type of stuff.
Do these themes show up in his fiction?
I haven't read enough of his fiction to know that. I know with Tar, that's more about – because that was written in 1918. He's more responding to what was going on with World War I and the type of people – who were of fighting age in World War I. I don't know if this is covered in any of his other fiction. I do know that with Snooty Baronet, he's mocking quite a bit the pretensions and attitudes of British high society and well-known figures within it.
So the line that stuck with me is, "We are the cavemen of the new mental wilderness." He's talking about the rise of the subjective. And it's a fascinating story about how this new subjective way of thinking comes about. I haven't had long enough to digest it and integrate it with the other things that I think, so I can't say what I think about it. But, I guess I'll read more of the quote. "We have been thrown back wholesale from the external, the public world by the successive waves of the Newtonian innovation and been driven down into our primitive, private mental caves of the unconscious and the primitive." he's talking about science displacing. It's so
basically science gives you a new fundamental understanding of yourself, and if that completely transforms the way you understand yourself as a person, then the previous cultural traditions are going to have a hard time connecting with these aspects.
I don't know that that's what he's saying. I think that really what it is that there's like a objectivity and science are being set at odds with each other, because with science, it is dictated to you and there's no space for discussion anymore. And the only thing that an artist can talk about, the only thing that you can philosophize about is the subjective, because this whole domain that was once political in the sense of being an object of discussion is now the domain of the science, right? It's been taken away from you, and you're left in this cave, right? In this problem of not being able to say anything that is able to relate to someone else's cave. Sorry, I've got another quote. But he's talking about the artist as well, how as a result of this, the ironies abound, right? The fact of this new subjectivity makes it so that the subject is less in touch with his own subjectiveness in a strange way. He describes the artist or writer as almost always a priorist. Further, he tends to lose his powers of observation, which through reliance upon external nature in the classical ages gave him freedom altogether. Yet observation must be the only guarantee of his usefulness as much as of his independence, so he takes his nature in practice from theoretic field and resigns himself to see only what conforms to his syllabus of patterns. He deals with the raw life, thinks he sees arabesques in it, but in fact the arabesque patterns that he sees more often than not emanate from his theoretic borrowing. He has put them there. A lot of it's about freedom, this book, and the way that I don't want to call it Marxist. It's certainly not Marxist, but there's like a way that like the contradictions of a previous state of the world lead to these ironic outcomes, right? Where like the more nationalism, the more homogenization, because all these people who used to inhabit their different niches of these multi-ethnic empires, they're now in these nation-state boxes which are competing in one game, and in order to win that game, they have to get good at the same thing, so they become more like each other, ironically, right? And by being more subjective, you're less able to be in touch with your primary observations. Again, this is all stuff that in the last few days of reading this book I had never really thought about it before, so it's not really integrated into any greater fabric of thought, but it's very interesting stuff. I like it.
Yeah, Lewis will cause you to, as I said, re-examine some of your own ideas, and you may still at the end of it still believe the things you previously believed, but he is going to force you to think about it. And in terms of the subjective aspect of it, I mean, Bowden talked about this in his lecture on Wyndham Lewis. He said during the lecture, another very controversial text about race is called Paleface, which is an attack, action, on the cult of the primitive and the works of the people like D.H. Lawrence. Lawrence and Lewis had a standing hostility to each other. This is very ironic, but also metaphysically true, because Lawrence is a pagan and a vitalist, but in some ways really a perennial heathen and a traditionalist. And Lewis is a violent erupter of modern discourse. Although not a subjectivist and a relativist in pure sense, he is a Nietzschean. He believes that there is a separation between the modern and that which has preceded it. In a sense, what he's saying subjectively in terms of his teleology, in a way, is that we don't know absolute truth. Absolute truths exist, otherwise everything is meaningless, but we cannot entirely configure them in our own destiny. We arrive at the understanding of the possibility of their configuration through struggle, through life, through dialectic, through reordering the energy within matter. It's the difference, if you like, between Nietzsche and Ebola. That's why the two of them would clash in a way that they did. They detested each other, basically. And so with this, talking about this aspect of like being cavemen of the new mental wilderness, we've been thrown... There's been a complete disruption that's occurred that has thrown us back into a subjective sphere, as he says in Paleface, that we no longer live in the external world. He says in the following paragraph, in the arts of formal expression, a dark night of the soul is settling down. A kind of mental language is in process of invention, flouting and overriding the larynx and the tongue. Yet an art that is subjective and can look to no common factors of knowledge or feeling and lean on no tradition is exposed to the necessity, first of all, of instructing itself far more profoundly as to the origins of its impulses and the nature and history of the formulas with which it works, or else is committed to becoming a zealous parrot of systems and judgments that reach it from the unknown. So what he's essentially saying here is, and his belief is that that the only way to get back on track, essentially, or to get onto a higher track is through the dialectic struggle of fighting and discovery. But what he's saying is, but because of this disruption that we've been thrown back into a subjective space, that we no longer have a proper understanding of ourselves and the world that we live in, it's leading to all the soul searching, and there are now external forces that are attempting from the unknown that are attempting to influence this direction. And to put this in a concrete example, it's this exoticization and this fetishization of other races, because we no longer know who we are. The paleface no longer is losing discovery of who it is. It is now being subjected to kind of like almost like the Hegelian master-slave dialectic of the way that two different forces inform and influence each other. And if this process continues, the paleface will no longer be the master of his own destiny, but will be subjugated to these other influences, these outside racial influences, determining what the paleface will be in the future, which is why he views it as not as going back to some kind of source, that it all has to kind of be rebuilt. And the best way to do that is for all of the palefaces to mix together into a single cohesive race that's able to build its own new mythology, to create. And basically you can almost view, and this might be speculative on my part, the way I kind of interpret Lewis is that he's advocating for the start of a neo-romanticism, but the only way that you can have a neo-romanticism is if you have a neo-people to begin with.
That helps me. Yeah, because he's, I don't know, I mean, like Bowden says, he's an erupter. He is, resolutely directed forward into whatever the future has to hold. He says himself that he does not happen to regret the norm that is being superseded, and rather finds his sympathies on the side of the more universal norm, right? Which when I first at the very beginning of the book, and I was like, oh, what the heck kind of cosmopolitan anti-white stuff is this? But
the book's very shocking when you first read it. If you don't know what you're getting into, it's very shocking.
Yeah, no, and I mean, he's very much not like a turn back to tradition kind of guy, and yet in the citation you just it was a few citations ago, but like about art in the absence of tradition and authority and thrownness ultimately has to lie. It ultimately has to be supported by these sort of ersatz structures of theory, which in turn lead to the artist not being able to even observe anything. Anyway, so he sees the problem of tradition being wiped away. He clearly does not think that turning back to some older thing is the solution. And I do think that it does seem to me that you are speculating a little bit, but if you're right about where he's pointed with this, about the new melting pot and the Americanization of Europe leading to this new people that can form vital new traditions and that can support a new art and culture, then I'm starting to come around.
One major problem I have with Lewis, and I believe I cite this actually in both of my forewords, I try to avoid too much editorializing language, but I do see this as kind of easy to spot once you notice it, is Lewis, despite as radical and forceful as he is in his criticism, tends to pull punches on what he actually wants. He comes off quite a bit as hedging his bets, and people who have Frederick Jameson, who's a very important figure in the development of postmodern thought, he did an entire book on Wyndham Lewis called Fables of Aggression. And he castigates Lewis a number of times throughout the book for this aspect that he says he sees fundamentally Lewis as somewhat of a conservative figure because he's not willing to follow through on his radical critiques and do radical action, which is why it's hard to sometimes know what he actually advocated for, because he didn't want to be kind of pinned to that. I mean, with the Hitler thing, he walked that back. He pulped that book and then wrote a blistering attack on Hitler later, despite what he had previously written. He became more conservative and more reactionary as he grew older, and he just didn't seem to be able to deal with the backlash that he got. But the fact that he kind of played it both ways is also one of the reasons why he's never really been fully, I guess, for lack of a better way of saying this, canceled on a literary level.
And just as an example, substantiate your point about him hedging his bets, there's a point where he says that the most powerful argument against the extension of an anti-white campaign, namely that the great majority of palefaces are now in the same boat as their colored friends, that obviously they are in the position of fellow slaves and not of a white conqueror at all, which just sounds a lot like kind of Tucker Carlson multiracial populism to me.
Yes. In fact, actually, I'll read for you some of what I put this into the foreword. So this is basically a sample of the foreword I wrote. Here's what different critics, critics studying him after the fact. These are modern critics. Or contemporary critics. This is what contemporary critics have to say about Wyndham Lewis's work, Paleface. Those who have studied the works of Lewis and its breadth have come away from reading Paleface with wildly different and opposing interpretations of the work. Loathsome Jews and Engulfing Women by Andrea Lowenstein views Paleface as an expanded examination of the threatened extinction of the white race that shifted Lewis's focus from women and homosexuals to blacks as a feared and hated other, paving the way for Lewis's next shift to a racist anti-Semitism in Hitler. By contrast, Wyndham Lewis, a critical guide, says, though it is far from being a taintless document, it cannot be considered as, in any meaningful sense, racist. Katrin Frisch, in her work on modernist writers and fascism called The F-Word, gives a pretty comprehensive analysis of the hidden complexity in Paleface and why it engenders debate among the few who have read it. And so this is from The F-Word. Indeed, Paleface is a dense and complicated text on a sensitive topic written in Lewis's customary cynical tone. Yet it would be easy to stamp it as a simple racist track as part of the argument addresses an important issue which has lost little of its validity. For Paleface discusses white writers who use people of color as a convenient trope to establish an antidote to white, i.e. modern civilization. Thus, while authors such as D.H. Lawrence and Sherwood Anderson celebrate non-white cultures for their freedom from oppressive conventions and romanticize their connection to nature, Lewis quite rightly considers these depictions, as well as that at least as he perceives it, widespread obsession with black culture problematic. So far, this argument offers a legitimate critique that is still relevant today, as Terence Hagarty also observed when he remarked that it was Lewis who first classified Uncle Tomism. However, from here, Lewis's argument veers into a form of white supremacy that today might fall under the label of ethno-pluralism. Lewis sees the preoccupation with people of color in literature as well as cultural influences such as jazz, which remained a major target throughout Lewis's life, as an anti-white agenda. He bemoans the fact that there are no advocates for the palefaces, and he fears that an appreciation of people of color and their culture would not lead to equality, but a reversal of racial power hierarchies. Paleface is a defense of white culture, an attack against harmful primitivism, harmful for the people who are turned into tropes, but also harmful for white culture, which gets inundated with anti-white sentiment. And I think though the fact that you have these wildly different perspectives on specifically this book just really proves how much Lewis was careful in the way that he wrote it and the way that he positioned himself. That's one, and like I said, that's one of the major issues I have with Lewis, is that why I end up speculating on what he might be arguing for, because he didn't really argue for anything. More often than not, in a lot of his critical writings, he's arguing against types of things. He's arguing against the types of people in Snooty Baronet. He's arguing against types of literature and thinking and cultural thinking in Paleface. The closest you can kind of get to him being, and in fact, actually even in Hitler, he's not even really arguing for Hitler. He's arguing against what Weimar Germany, Weimar Berlin had become. And he does see a promise possibly in what the National Socialists can bring, because he compares them more favorably towards Action Française, Charles Maurrat's project, which was a lot more monarchist, kind of religious reactionary, the type of stuff that I think a lot of us are very familiar with now because it's had a renaissance on Twitter with a lot of Twitter Catholics. He's arguing against that type of stuff and sees what the National Socialists are promising to bring as something that has a lot more potentiality in being new and forceful and being able to sweep away the rot that's happened in Weimar Berlin. Other than that, you don't often get a sense of what he's actually for, and I think that's by design. He doesn't want to be tarnished with having to put too much advocacy on something because he's seen what happens when you advocate for something you're just completely wrong on. It tends to destroy your reputation.
I wonder if it's possible to actually have that as a consistent position or walk that line consistently where he's trying to be kind of like an aloof, perhaps, critic of these things, but he can't stoop so low as to have an opinion on what should be done. I don't know. What do you think about this question? If this is the transformation is good and he's ultimately in support of a melting pot idea, if not necessarily quite in the same way that people understand it in the American context today, but he is in support of it. He's in support of, he's at least says he is against any kind of racial superiority or supremacy at all. And kind of like you were talking earlier, he criticizes white people as well because he wants them to improve themselves. So basically they have to go through this period of struggling with their vices and with the insufficiency of their existing ideas and their existing modes of being. Well, then why speak up for them at all? Why go out of his way to speak up for the paleface? Isn't that kind of like, your kid's not doing too well on the soccer field, so like you start yelling at the coach, or like you run out there and help him? Like shouldn't they struggle through this on their own? Like what's the reason for his interjecting himself as this reluctant white advocate?
I think it's just because he didn't have the courage of his own convictions. I think he liked fascism. I think he liked National Socialism, but milling about with those other modernist writers and the like, he knew what the reception on that would be if he had gone full-throated. I mean, he had written this, many years before the Spanish Civil War, but there were only 4 writers from Britain. So there was this writer survey that was sent out when the Spanish Civil War started, polling all of these very well-known writers in Britain, which side do you support? And you had 3 choices. You could pick the Republican side, you could pick the nationalist side, or you could just say neither. And they polled something like around 100 or over 100 writers. It was a lot. I just remember that. Only 4 sided with the nationalists. It was, I know Arthur Machen was one of them. I'm trying to remember who the other 3 were. So, but Lewis knows writers like, he ends up meeting writers like Ernest Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and all these other people. And Hemingway even wrote about meeting Wyndham Lewis in A Movable Feast, which was his memoir about his times in Paris and Britain and all these this incredible explosive literary and artistic time period going on. And their nickname for Lewis was the measuring worm, because they made fun of him because he always was dressed in what they called a pre-war uniform. He was like doing the equivalent of wearing a fedora in his time period, essentially. Like now, when you see a guy wearing a fedora, there's an anachronistic aspect of that people find mockable. Well, he was wearing clothes that people found mockable in that time period. And Hemingway was so brutal in his depiction of Lewis that he basically said, and I'm not exaggerating what this is, he had the look of an unsuccessful rapist, which might be one of the worst things I've ever seen somebody described as. And the point of all this is that Lewis is meeting these people who have a lot, either are outright communists or have very socialist left-wing leanings. And so he knows the type of reception he's going to get for a forceful pro-fascism, pro-national socialism thing. Like, he dipped his toe into these waters. He thought he could be the irascible, critic who's just, I'm just observing something. I think, there's some good points here, but the reaction to it was never favorable, which is why after he published Hitler, he stepped away from that quite considerably. This is kind of an experimental period for him to see what he thinks he can get away with. He didn't have the courage to go all the way on this stuff. which leads to him hedging his bets often and trying to, it's, the whole aspect of like, I'm not a National Socialist, but, they did have some like interesting ideas. Like that's where a lot of people end up starting when they're like trying to seek permission to be able to engage in this stuff. And that's what Lewis was kind of doing in his time period, but he wasn't willing to, ultimately he decided he wasn't going to see it through. I mean, Mosley talked in his memoirs about Wyndham Lewis used to come to the BUF meetings, but he was always like, he tried to disguise himself, and he was always very paranoid about being spotted at these meetings. He didn't want to be associated. Like he was interested in this stuff, but he was terrified of the association marring his reputation.
Quite unfortunate.
Yeah, which is why like, as much as I do enjoy reading Wyndham Lewis, because he's an interesting figure, that's why I also do have these large criticisms of him, because I think you can see this come out in his writings, which is why it's sometimes you can struggle with Wyndham Lewis because he is asking you challenging questions, but you can also struggle with it because he's not really telling you what exactly he believes. You can tell he's holding something back.
On another note, I was wondering if you could talk some about H.L. Mencken and Lewis's lengthy critique of him. For me, Mencken is, I have not read the guy, and I just sort of know him as a name. I have a vague sense. I know that there are people who are vaguely in our neck of the woods politically who relate positively to Mencken. So it was interesting the way that Lewis went after him, particularly for his sort of misanthropic and, well, I guess for the fact that his attack on simple religious Americans being ultimately ineffective and not as cutting as Mencken thought it would be. But yeah, if you could just talk about Mencken.
Well, H.L. Mencken was very important writer and journalist in the early 20th century. I assume most people listeners know about Mencken, or at least about his, are familiar with some funny things that he wrote. He was a very witty writer. He's also very important in early 20th century literary criticism because he helped popularize writers that were lesser known, and he also helped make Americans more aware of Nietzsche, because he was a little bit of a Germanophile because his wife was German, or was born to German parents. And so he had this tremendous cultural impact on it, but he was very much a reactionary figure. He coined the term the bourgeoisie, that he was always railing against American boobery. But there was kind of this sneering elitism that Mencken inhabited, which would have definitely prickled Lewis a bit. I mean, he would have seen Mencken as the type of figure he was making fun of in Snooty Baronet. Just assuming this position of this unearned position of superiority over the rabble, over the palefaces. And Mencken had a role in, even though he had written edgy things, or what we would call edgy, he was very much just kind of part of that American reactionary tradition where you might say some edgy, critical things, you might make fun of other groups, but you're not actually advocating for any policies that's fundamentally changing anything in the United States. You're just kind of assuming a position of like pointing at other people's stupidity and foibles. And that kind of stuff really bothered Lewis a lot. It's funny because we just criticized Lewis for not really saying what he's in favor of, but he viewed himself as he did view himself as apart from these people. I guess it would be a situation of, while he wasn't willing to go all the way with his convictions, he also resented this idea that he resented anybody who didn't seem to be examining their own perspectives and own ideas of things. And Mencken falls squarely kind of into the crosshairs of what is bothering Lewis so much in Paleface, because he views Mencken as one of these types of tastemakers that's saying really nothing while also attacking people for their perceived boobery.
See, but like the thing that's I'm going to quote Lewis here. He says, the conversion of millions of Negroes into coffee-colored Babbitts is not an exceedingly stimulating picture for the revolutionary mind, nor for the intelligent person of whatever political opinion, right? So Babbitt being the main character of Sinclair Lewis's satirical novel, which
Mencken loved. He loved Sinclair Lewis and he loved Babbitt. He used the term Babbitt all the time.
Right, but this is Lewis saying that turning blacks into middle-class whites would not be an improvement. So I don't know where he gets off. I haven't read Mencken, but like it seems like he's guilty of a similar sort of sneeringness towards. Maybe I'm just defensive of middle-class white people. But.
Well, he's sorry because it's been a couple months since I read this. If I'm remembering correctly, basically his problem with Mencken is he's attacking middle-class white people. But he views Mencken as part of the same process that either fetishizes and exoticizes brown people or gives them passes when they would be no better, if not worse. And so one of the biggest issues that Lewis has with a lot of these writers is he views them as very anti-white in a way that goes beyond even kind of, what would be valid criticisms of white people to be able to, come into their own. He sees it as venomous, and especially because when you do that type of stuff, it allows these brown people, these black people to fill in the space. Like by doing this constant attack on the palefaces, a implication emerges that, well, maybe it would be better than that if we have middle-class black people that take over these white, like, middle-class boobs. And Lewis is like, no, you have to be cognizant of what you're doing when you're attacking these people, that you're opening the venue for this exoticization and fetishization to come in. Because if all you hear constantly is white people bad, white people bad, white people bad, you don't even have to necessarily have this xenophilia towards other people. That's just going to emerge naturally, because if all of this is so bad, then maybe I need to find something else. Maybe there's a better people that can take over that can replace these really bad people.
The section where he talks about Mencken is actually, I think you alluded to this, it's one of the sections where he kind of comes to the defense of the paleface, like the most instinctively, where he starts off by saying Mencken is performing some useful social function generally, and that he likes him because, he ridicules things that are silly, and it's good to ridicule things that are silly. But as he goes on, he ends up siding more and more with people in the examples that Mencken would reprint and ridicule and say, well, honestly, these are American peasants in Kentucky or whatever, they're just living their life the way that they are, and it's perfectly natural, and there's actually nothing wrong with it. There's actually much more wrong with the kind of snobbish, middle to upper class readers of this who, have no thought of what they're engaged in by reading it or by laughing at these people or how silly that they are in many ways.
Yeah, that's when I agree with that 100% there.
Well, that helps, both of you guys. Thank you. Well, the last major thing that I wanted to touch on was the Puritanism part, which is at the very beginning, where he, I don't know, first of all, it was interesting in that beginning section how he cited these books that were sort of like middle-brow, flash-in-the-pan books that don't survive anymore, at least among not in the same way that D.H. Lawrence and Ernest Hemingway are kind of household names among moderately educated people. But yeah, he cites extensively from some Puritan theologian called Green, who writes in favor of extreme self-abnegation and abstention from any sort of, forget about creature comforts, but even from intellectual betterment of oneself, in favor of just selflessly giving and giving and giving until every last member of the colored masses is raised to the very same level. And it seems like he sees that trend of Northwestern European religion as being particularly poisonous and related to this later tendency. So what do you think about that?
These are for people who've followed a lot of these arguments that have been, I guess, in the far right, online right, dissident right, whatever term you want to use, the scene especially for the last 10 years. This is going to be very familiar, this attack on Puritans, and it's funny that he's talking about this in the early 20th century. this is one of the most fascinating things about this book is just how little the discourse has changed in many ways, that many of the same ideas and the same arguments are still being debated 100 years later. And the Puritan argument is the same, that it's about the self-abrogation, that this is what's leading to this spiritual disease and decline within the white man, within the palefaces, because they're engaging in these self-destructive, humiliating acts, which again, when you do that from Lewis's perspective, it's going to cause people to look then towards other forces to fill the vacuum and the hole that's been formed by this constant self-hatred, self-attack, self-destruction. And so Lewis has a very dim view on Christian morality, but especially of the Calvinist, Puritan kind, which is unsurprising because I think Bowden was correct to call him a Nietzschean in this aspect. It's taking a people and convincing them to denigrate themselves into being lowly Untermensch, and to use the kind of Nietzschean terminology on this. And he would like to see a complete. This goes hand in hand with this idea of like just that things have to be burst through into a new paradigm, into a new thought process, into a new morality. That this stuff. This is why he also doesn't like. Is it very against tradition? Because like you could call this a traditional morality that has formed, and he sees it as leading to where the palefaces are. So from his perspective, like this just has to be abandoned. This has to be completely uprooted, and a new man has to be formed. That's what I mean. One of the most forceful things he says in this book is the mixing of the palefaces in Europe into a singular people. And part of that process, you can tell from the way he castigates Puritan morality, is that stuff also needs to be uprooted. In a way, Lewis believes that that's why he goes after all these different subjects in this book. The slate needs to be wiped clean. With the elements that are currently present that they have to work with, things just need to be started over in order to be able to avoid the problems coming that he sees.
Excellent. That's what I've got. Taylor, do you have any other stuff to bring us to?
So I did really like the portion right at the beginning here, just talking about Puritanism. It, as an American Protestant myself, struck me as extremely relevant because it's such a good description and such a good foreshadowing of the kinds of dynamics that exist today and that are so destructive. To kind of restate the argument or what he's criticizing, it's that let me read this quote that's found page 11 at the very top. The Christian citizen sees a multitude of persons who in their actual present condition may have no advantage over the slaves of the ancient state, but who in undeveloped possibility and in the claims which arise out of that possibility are all that he himself is. Seeing this, he finds a necessity laid upon him. It is no time to enjoy the pleasure of eye and ear, of search for knowledge, of friendly intercourse, of applauded speech or writing, while the mass of men whom we declare to be meant with us for eternal destinies are left without the chance of making themselves enact what in possibility we believe them to be. So it's an incredibly revolutionary, which he says, incredibly collectively destructive idea to infect a people with, that you're like really your purpose as an individual is to, wherever there could possibly be inequality found on the globe, that is your problem. And as long as it exists, there is nothing else that you can do or concern yourself with. It's, the kind of criticism that many Christians, and maybe, although I'm not sure, but at least from my experience, Protestants specifically will face when dealing with political issues, was like, how could you possibly concern yourself with that when there are unsaved souls? Although at the same time, they also do want to materially benefit other people. For some reason, never, Americans or white people or Europeans, but somehow this crusade put everything aside in the purpose of the salvation of souls also extends to giving them material benefits that align with their racial self-interest, but not our racial self-interest. So that there, at least, I think is one contradiction that kind of betrays the theological failings of this idea, but just as a matter of how well it describes how people think and how destructive that idea is, I really appreciated that portion at the beginning.
Yeah, and that beginning portion really lays out, for Paleface, what Lewis believes is kind of in the first part, and then the second part is just him adding more arguments to what he's already stated. He almost kind of puts his conclusion first in a way, with the way that he wrote this, but it's because he wrote the parts at different at different times, so he had kind of a different minds. He was in a different headspace each time he was writing these aspects. But the way he sees that, and he's seeing in America, it having just finished, it was the American Empire at its own zenith, and so he sees this. Where America is, it's got all these black people, and he sees parts of the reason why they're there and residing there is not just the economics of slavery and crops, but also because of this desire to civilize through Christianity. And the American Empire going overseas to these Pacific islands, for many of the people that participated in that on the ground level, it was to bring Christianity and to civilize these Pacific Islanders. And going into the Asian countries and bringing them Christianity and trying to civilize them this way. He sees this as inevitably going to be with the Christian ethic, that this is going to inevitably lead to the upturning of a racial hierarchy because of the self-abrogation, the self-castigation that comes with the way that he views that this religion is being practiced. So that's why he's one of the big reasons why he's talking about it. And these are arguments we've heard other people have independently come to, because it's just this problem that is, you can make a Christian argument for nationalism, but you can also make a Christian argument for this stuff that's happening too. This is when text can be interpreted and there's no central authority that can mandate what the only interpretation is going to be. You can easily lead to situations where all these various different interpretations are competing and they can't be stopped, and we're going to be living with the after effects of that aspect, which is one of the reasons why he has such a huge problem with this type of Christian morality.
Sean, were you going to say something?
I don't remember what it was.
Now, this is speculative on my part, kind of going back to what is it that Lewis wants. I think I am just making this up, but when I read his stuff, it sounds like what he really wants, without him actually outright saying, is he just wants what Plato's Republic advocated for. I think that's fundamentally what Lewis's perspective is, that if you want to have a just and sane society, it's going to require the type of stratification and philosopher kings that are discussed in Plato's Republic, where you have this eugenic society that's being guided from the top in a very meaningful and very explicit and direct way.
That's what I was going to go to next, because that comes out, I think, maybe not directly, but indirectly in line in the text, in the procession of logic from the criticism of Puritanism. And I think it's also, seemed to me at least, it's one of the parts of the book where, like you're saying, it's clearest that he's actually giving his own opinion in a just direct and straightforward way. So let me read. But beyond that, I suggest that very few people can be free under any circumstances, or equally you may say that very few people can be persons, still to employ the Roman terminology, but in this case abstractly. And then even more clearly, he's talking about, well, let me pull up the context here.
And part of that's a continuation of the type of stuff he was writing about in The Art of Being Ruled.
Mm-hmm. So there are very few men that are able to be free, or very few to be persons. But he says, well, the retort is, well, what about everybody else? Like, does that mean that you hate people, basically, I guess? Or, do you not believe in equality or equal rights? And he says, in the first place, the plan is, of course, not mine at all, but nature's. Nature has repeatedly been interrogated, often angrily, upon this very point. Why does not nature produce a dense mass of Shakespeare's or Newton's or Pitt's? That has been the idea, and means have been considered and plans worked out for assisting nature in this respect. But it is conceivable that nature, after all, may usually produce as many as are needed of these persons, and that this ratio may be according to some organic law that we are too stupid or too conceited to grasp. And he goes on to also talk about how this desire to equalize everybody results in anger and pulling down of people of great talent or ability. So, and that was what, basically that was what occurred to me when I was reading the first part where he's talking about the Puritan philosopher Green and how what some of the results of this are, especially as we can see it today, is that it's basically ultimately an attack on humanity itself in a way, in the sense that it only ever results in the degradation of greatness and hierarchy and the devaluing of, I guess you can bring it back to probably like a very common and very trite conservative talking point, but you can only equalize by pulling everybody down, not by lifting them up. I think it's all the more tragic from my perspective that so many people have adapted Christianity to this purpose.
Yeah, with Lewis as well, because he made it clear, one of the funniest aspects of Paleface is that, and why you can't parse his words sometimes, I bring this criticism up in the foreword because he wants an abolition. He claims to want an abolition of all supremacies, which actually flies quite in the face of his anti-democratic and elitist sensibilities that he promoted in works such as The Lion and the Fox, which is about the hero in the role of Shakespeare and the art of being ruled. One of the contemporary critics of, or rather, a current academic, Tyrus Miller, who his specialty is in these modernist writers, he notes this aspect of Lewis's skepticism towards liberal democracy, as where Lewis suggests that for the ruled himself among them, the open exercise of power in fascist and communist countries might be preferable to liberal democracy's production of consensus through culture. So when Lewis writes this in Paleface, it's somewhat hard to take him at his word that this is what he wants. That the whites on their side are being given a certain consciousness. This dual process is what I've been discussing. For the colored peoples are urged to develop a consciousness of superiority. In the same book, seeks to force upon the paleface a corresponding sense of inferiority. It is this that is unfortunate, the mere reversal of a superiority, a change in its color, nothing more, rather than its total abolition. I think the actual views of Lewis you're going to see much more prominently in this first part, and you see it much more prominent in his annoyance and dislike of Christian morality, which he sees it as having that leveling effect on people. He, again, like much like how he didn't want to be forceful in his support of, as forceful in his support of fascism and National Socialism, that is what he wants. Like he wants a vanguard. He wants a elitist cultural vanguard that's able to prevent all of these kinds of weird moralities that, as he views it, these weird moralities, these weird cultural notions, these weird reversals of power from being seeded into average people's minds. He wants there to be an actual explicit display of power, to know who the power is and to know what the tastes are actually going to be, what the culture is actually going to be, instead of the way that everything is diffused in liberal democracy and you're having to deal with attacks and forces on multiple fronts. Because now, if you look through Paleface, he talks about Christian morality, he talks about the book readers, he talks about all kinds of different aspects of what he sees as contributing to this problem, and the fact that there is all these multiple sources for a problem is one of the reasons why he just wants the society as it is to be torn down, not go back to something that previously was, but start over.
I think you maybe said this exact same thing, but I'm just going to repeat it for emphasis that like this passage that Taylor brought us to is the strongest evidence, I think, for the idea that he's not telling us the truth when he says, like, hey, really all I want is racial equality, I'm happy with all this cosmopolitan stuff, right? Because, like, yeah, look, anyone who takes inequality seriously is our guy on some level, even if they're too afraid to really become it on some level. Yeah, I will argue to my dying day that, like, even the libertarians have something of us in them because they see inequality, and that's the most important thing, and then you just get, like, routed off onto some unfortunate exit ramp.
Yeah, Frederick Jameson castigated Lewis for doing this type of stuff in his entire book critique of Lewis, Fables of Aggression, which is a very difficult. By the way, I do not recommend reading Frederick Jameson's book, Fables of Aggression. I mostly just quote mine from it because it is a very difficult book to read because he gets into some extremely esoteric literary criticism that I'm not even familiar with. But this is what he says about Lewis. The intellectual authority of the culture critique depends on the repression of this concrete social situation and on the projection of its anxieties into some more timeless realm of moral judgment. The sense of placelessness, the illusion of absolute values thereby produced, discloses the constitutive idealism of this genre, which formally tends to express a classical conservatism, even where its content seems to contradict the form. Lewis was often, in this sense, merely a conservative. And so what he's saying there, because he's using language that can give you pause because you might not understand what he's necessarily saying immediately, is that for all of Lewis's talk of having to forge a new path, of wiping the slate clean, of attacking all of these different aspects of society, he has a tendency to not be forceful in what he actually wants and to fall back into much more classically conservative arguments and perspectives on things, such as what we just cited there. But I just want all supremacies to end. He has a conservative tendency that he cannot escape within himself in his writing. And so when reading this book, when you come across these types of sentiments, I think you can just disregard them as that. I don't think that's what Lewis actually believes. I think he's just does not have the courage of his own convictions. It's the stuff that's probably the most inflammatory that are probably what he actually believes. Stuff like hating Christian morality and wanting to be an advocate for palefaces. I think that actually is what he believes. I don't think he in his heart of hearts wants to has this more conservative position, but he allows himself to lapse into that because he won't allow himself to go all the way in his writings.
There's another interesting part that I thought was particularly relevant today and haven't often seen this dealt with, but this would be, so I'm going to read from page 98, and this is part of the section where he's talking about, I suppose, kind of what we were talking about, or what you guys were talking about earlier. Honestly, this was a little bit of a more difficult section for me to follow, but he's basically talking about the systems of thought surrounding art and artists and how they, are incapable of seeing their own biases and so on. So he writes, I dignify this critical work with the title of system because as literature stands today, it in reality amounts to that. It is a system that will enable any fairly intelligent man, once he opens his mind to it and seizes its main principles, to read under an entirely new light almost everything that is written at the present time. So he's talking about his system of critiquing the literature that he's going to be critiquing. Works of sociology, fiction, history, philosophy, claiming to be on the one hand conceived objectively according to the non-human methods of ideal science, will be found on close inspection in most instances to be all too human and to be serving ends anything but scientific. And in another class, works of fiction claiming only to be ingenuous works of art will be found to be saturated with political doctrine or with attitudes of mind imposed upon the many in the first place not by pure pleasure experts, but by political experts, devising means of ruling people by working on their senses and emotions. And then this is the part which I especially am interested in. In order, of course, to employ this system effectively, the reader must acquaint himself with many things of a sort that do not come his way in the ordinary course of life. He must accustom himself to regarding the means by which people are ruled today as very much more shrewd and elaborate than is generally believed. And I'll read one more section on what I see as the same topic from page 108. Hence, it would lie much more in your power than you are accustomed to think to change yourself, just as it would be to change your environment in any of the great variety of ways, provided you had the imagination and the necessary power. So what I took from his discussion is that the observation of how much people lack political imagination in many ways, and specifically in the way that it does not occur to them to believe, or they would not want to believe, that all of society is basically a system of, or specifically liberal democratic society is a system of control through ideas and through the hegemony of those ideas in every aspect of their lives. And conversely, and this I think also an attitude that we all probably encounter all the time, people can't conceive that anything could have happened a different way than it did, or that, there could be any significant change of direction. They can't they don't want to get on board with the idea of revolutionary political change. They can't imagine that such a thing could be possible. It just comes off as silly. So what are you guys' thoughts about that?
Well, it's very fitting for the time period that Lewis is living in, because liberalism, the first political theory, was firmly established, and despite the fact that you had this formation of the second political theory, which was communism, that only at Lewis's time that only took place in one country, which was Russia, which was the most backward and most autocratic and reactionary of all the European nations. It also had a lot of other circumstances that made it unique compared to other European nations because of its frontier empire with all these other non-European peoples that were living within the borders of the Russian Empire. So the fact that communism still had not been able to take root in any of the developed liberal German countries tended to show the strength of this system. Now, you had the rise of fascism in Italy now in Lewis's time, but the jury was still out on how effective that was from the perspective of these writers and how different it really was. So for Lewis, you have these liberal societies that even as they've calcified, but there seems to be no hope of any actual fundamental change really happening in these places. A type of liberal realism had taken over. There will be this doctrine of equality, and there's just no escaping from it. There's no other possible system that can form, and we're just going to continue down this path towards its inevitable conclusion, that Whig history is a scientific law. And you had writers like Lewis that were trying to figure this out. Is there a way that this is not true? Is there a way that something different can be formed? And how would such a thing even happen? And really what it comes down to is you need a complete system of change of consciousness and mindset because of the way that liberalism impacts people in their political thinking process.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, there's a lot of different topics in this book that I think each could probably take about as much time as we've taken to discuss the ones we did.
This is why I had such a huge problem writing this forward, why it took me months, because I wasn't sure how to tackle this. At one point, I said to myself, I need to stop, because I had a plan to write about 4,000 more words, but the problem is when you do that, you end up going down these various different rabbit holes and having to discuss those topics, so people have the bigger picture of it. And I realized I said what needs to be said specifically about this book.
Right.
People will come up to
by John Chapman.
Yeah. People will come to their own conclusions, their own perspectives, their own interpretations of this work. I don't need to tell them what to think about it. I just need to introduce the book.
I thought your foreword was very good, and it was a very good guide into difficult book at times. There was just one more topic that I did want to hit on because I thought there was a particularly good quote, and that is we kind of mentioned this very briefly earlier, which is the Jewish question, at least in this book, which I don't believe that the publisher of the Borzoi books that you brought up, Knopf, or however it's pronounced, I'm pretty sure Lewis does not mention that he's Jewish at any point, and he doesn't have any systemic blame for the Jews at all in this book, and really has, from my reading, very little negative to say about them. But there's places where I think you can really see how that puts a gap in his understanding of the causes for things. And this is one specifically, so I'm going to read from page 142. I think this is the section where he's talking about the student suicides and, generally speaking, the effect on a race from losing its consciousness or its will to live, basically. And so he's talking about these people, and he says, they have allowed themselves to remain romantic, show a tendency now to destroy themselves. Some mind more cunning than the white has enveloped them and infected them with a consciousness not their own. And he says, and if we look around for the possessor of this more cunning mind than the white mind, able to destroy it with its alien consciousness, then we need not go to a hostile race. We can find it in the mind of science. So that basically, I think, goes back to a lot of the conversation that you guys were having earlier about how prominently science figures into his explanation for the degradation of the European race. And, I think that probably all agree that it's definitely a part of it, but it's certainly not the end of the story. And I think this is one particular instance where you see him, he's almost got it. And I don't know what his own personal beliefs, again, what his real personal beliefs were on the subject or not, but when he says some mind more cunning than the white has enveloped them and infected them with a consciousness not their own, that's the Jewish question in this book.
I think he's afraid of Jews. I think he knew they were an issue, which is why, because with the people he was talking to, with the type of subjects he got interested in, there's no way he didn't come up on this. There's no way I just don't believe that he couldn't have known that Knopf was Jewish. But he tries to basically cover himself constantly, not just in this book, but in other work. So, for example, in Paleface, he says on page 211, where he's talking about art in Europe, "It is for that reason that I have said elsewhere that I consider this century has to its credit more art of the best kind than all the other centuries of European art put together, except the age of the Renaissance. This is, no doubt, partly due to the Jewish influence, partly to the fact that..."
I noticed that part too.
And he got worse about this after the Hitler debacle, because Hitler kind of did his Hitler book also kind of the Hitler book pulled a lot of punches on this as well. And because of the backlash that he got for this, he wrote, the funny thing is, like, he's still criticized for the title of this book, but it's because people didn't pick up the reference on what he was making. He wrote a book a couple of years after he had written Hitler, called "The Jews, Are They Human?" And people who see that as anti-Semitic don't realize he is making a reference to I think the book was called "The English, Are They Human?" And the book "The Jews, Are They Human?" is very philo-Semitic. So I'll read actually from the Hitler foreword where I discuss this aspect. "Meanwhile, in "The Jews, Are They Human?" Lewis throws himself at the feet of philo-Semitism, an easy task for an Englishman. Even within Hitler, Lewis was walking the edges of it, reminding his English audience just how much they had civilized the Jewish people and entered into harmonious matrimony with them. He continues this track in "The Jews, Are They Human?" writing obsequious passages to the Jews that were no doubt meant to chase off the audience that he feared he had cultivated. Lewis was a satirical writer who bit whom he could until he could draw the piss out of them. But "The Jews, Are They Human?" is so craven in its self-deprecatory humor, one can't help but think of a beaten dog scuttering around its master. Take, for example, this passage on the relationship between the Jews and the English. "Then, even if they did decide to remain with us, the Jews are one of the most industrious races in the world, and we are one of the least industrious. They will set a high standard of hard work, at least, which it will be necessary for the rest of us to live up to. That will be most salutary. It is worth paying people to come here to teach us how to work. We could not have better instructors." Now, you can argue he's being sarcastic with that, but the whole work is basically like that. He's trying to, again, have it both ways, where he's like, no, I take the piss out of everybody. I'm kind of mocking everybody. But what he was doing in Paleface is amplified in "The Jews, Are They Human?" of him trying to basically dodge these anti-Semitic accusations. And he's trying to engage in mild English anti-Semitism of overpraising, but it just doesn't land.
It's funny how similar that is to, because blaming Protestantism and flirting with it while also being an over-the-top anti-Semite sounds so much like the sort of BAP adjacent thing, right? Like the Protestant argument is the Voltbug argument. You're doing the same thing again.
Yeah, it's always sarcasm until they're your employers, and then you're just and you have to agree with them. So that's why I don't put too much stock in the sarcasm argument, because irony is a rearguard defense to avoid criticism of yourself. And the fact is that you can't take that as sarcasm at face value, because he repudiated all of his views on this type of stuff. So at most, it's just him being a little bit cheeky, but it's like, okay, well, I can get raunchy and racy jokes from somebody at the pub. I don't need to get this from a revolutionary writer.
When I was reading the book, I found him to be a kind of, it was funny to think about how he compares with several different kinds of current commentators and different political stripes of varyingly dissident varieties, which I won't name, but
I know what you mean. I had so many problems writing this, like trying not to make comparisons because it is amazing how little the discourse has actually changed. That's one of the most striking things about Paleface. Like I feel like I'm reading a really long Twitter post by somebody in a very specific sphere of Twitter.
Yeah, so I think he embodies more spheres of Twitter in himself than probably anyone else could. Most of them contrarian to varying degrees.
Yes.
All right, well, I think we should wrap this up here. So I guess, Borzoi, I'll give it to you for final thoughts first, then Sean, then myself.
Well, I guess my final thoughts on it kind of echo my original thoughts on this, is that this book is very well worth reading and examining, in both for its actual content, but also on a meta level. Because as I said, Lewis asks very challenging questions, and there's a resonance to some of the things he's saying, because, I mean, he talks about anti-whiteness in this book. And for this to be written in the 1920s and use that kind of language is very striking. And it's very, especially if you're interested in literature, the type of literary arguments he's making are very interesting. This is a book you might end up I feel like a lot of people will end up coming back to after they read it the first time. Maybe not immediately, but in a couple of years after reading it the first time, you'll want to come back to this and reread it, because some of the stuff's dated, but there is this timelessness in some of the things that he's saying, or at least the questions he's asking, which we can take, especially because, like, again, like, since it sounds like the discourse has never changed, we can apply it to things that we are talking about and the things that we are arguing about in the mindset we have towards it. But also on a meta level, because there are weaknesses and issues, I think, with this book, especially for people who are looking for something even more revolutionary. You can see this book as an example of the limitations of being an irony bro type person, or to just being a contrarian, or to be just asking questions or just making criticisms. You can see that there's inherent issues with the way that Lewis is going about this topic, and I think people can take that as an example of steps to avoid when writing kind of their own Paleface or trying to compose their own views on this.
I'll add that we've spent this whole time talking about, like, the content, and of course that discussion is well deserved. There's a lot of content there. But on the level of the prose, this man can write a sentence. He's very, very witty. There are sentences and passages that'll just hit you right in the gut. So very enjoyable on that level. And also as a historical artifact, it's very interesting. Like I mentioned at the start of the book, he cites from some things that don't live on now, right? He cites from, for example, there's this W.E.B. Du Bois fiction book, which sounds like just like the most pulpy garbage you can imagine. It's so cringe. I won't totally spoil it, but it's this weird black revenge fantasy about an international conspiracy of all of the colored races. It's hilarious. And just citing from other minor works of fiction that are sort of probably middle brow of the time and representative of maybe something comparable to a discussion of, like, the latest Netflix show or something like that. That was very interesting to me as a historical thing, aside from all of the various more conceptual thematic stuff we've touched on.
Yes. Borzoi, where can people find you? Or do you have anything that you want people to follow?
Well, so as of this recording, I am still at therightstuff.biz. I do a show with Mike called Pinovich and Boscovich, still on the third rail. But I would like to promote my Substack, but I haven't written in a while just because I have topics I want to get back into. So hopefully by the time this comes out, I'll be working on the Substack again. So I guess I'll promote that. Borzoi.substack.com. And I am, as of this time, still on Twitter at BorzoiTRS. So.
Super, and I'm Sean Bell. You can find my stories, find some of my newest stories on there, and I also have a book called Post that was released about maybe 2 years ago. So Borzoi, thanks a lot for coming on. It's like a flood of information when you speak. I really felt like I benefited a lot from it, and I hope you people out there in cyberspace enjoyed it as well. See you at the next one.